Hello, friends. Greetings. It is Tuesday, June 22nd, 2021. Modern U.S. history at Baruch College in the City University of New York. Hope you guys are doing well. We are on to World War II. Chapter 22 of Eric Foner's Give Me Liberty, Volume 2. Before we get there, though, I do have to mention that I forgot to give the ID terms in yesterday's video. Now, interestingly, no one reminded me that I hadn't done so. So I wonder why that could be. But anyway, here they are now. These are ID terms from yesterday's, that should have been in yesterday's video on the Great Depression and the New Deal. So the terms are Hoovervilles, Tennessee Valley Authority, Works Progress Administration, Huey Long, Welfare State, and Scottsboro Boys. Okay, the terms again are Hoovervilles, Tennessee Valley Authority, Works Progress Administration, Huey Long, Welfare State, and Scottsboro Boys. Those are the terms from yesterday that should have been in yesterday's video. They were not because I forgot. There you go. There'll be more terms at the end of this one, unless I forget, in which case they'll be tomorrow. We shall see. Anyway, the New Deal, which we discussed yesterday, did not deliver work and security to all Americans. It changed a lot of things. It made a lot of innovations in government, in national culture, in the way that the American economy worked, but it did not deliver work and security to all Americans, as Roosevelt promised. You know what did? World War II. It was the war that erased the losses of the Depression decade. It was the war that put people back to work at full employment. It was the war that delivered work and security to the American people. And in some ways, and this is something I just want you to keep in mind over the next couple classes, even into next week, it was the war, okay, that's not only set the terms on which the history of the United States would unfold over the second half of the 20th century. It's also the case that in some ways, the United States since World War II has been a war economy. It has been powered by and energized by a war, an economy that is mobilized at all times for war. In some ways, since the beginning of World War II, we have been living in a state of war mobilization, and that, perhaps more than anything else, has been the key to American wealth and power in the second half of the 20th century and since, in other words, in the years since World War II. And what I want you to pay attention to today, as you read this chapter 22 of Eric Foner, is a few things. First of all, the relationship between the Great Depression and the coming of World War II. The conflicts that led to World War II began to bubble up very early in the 1930s. They were already manifest. They were already starting. There were already skirmishes and battles and military conflicts by the mid-30s, both in Asia and in Europe. And those conflicts, those early conflicts especially, were very much a response to the economic hardship of the Great Depression and the 1930s, both in Europe and in Asia. Both the conflicts in Europe and in Asia came from the responses of certain governments there, especially Germany and Japan, to the circumstances of the Great Depression, and resulted from the attempts of Germany and Japan to solve the economic hardship that their countries were experiencing. That's what led to the beginning of World War II, and I want you to pay attention to how and why. Okay? The fact that the World War II started in these places, in Central Europe, in Europe and in Asia, literally oceans away from the United States, was again incredibly significant, just as it had been during World War I. The fact that World War II was bubbling up already in the mid-30s in both Europe and Japan, and allowed the United States, just as in World War I, critical years of neutrality. And it sounds strange when we say that the United States would be neutral now in the early years of World War II, because in retrospect, kind of the evil and the genocidal a terror of the Nazi regime is so obvious. But at that time, in the middle of the 1930s, it was by no means clear, at least to many Americans, that the United States would end up fighting Hitler and the Nazis. I mean, some of that was because there was at that time, in part because of the circumstances of economic hardship in the United States, a very strong movement for America First, which is a term that has resurfaced much more recently. America First was a strong idea that the United States should just, whatever was happening in Europe, whatever was happening in Asia, the U.S. should just stay out of it and take care of its own affairs. Many other people were strongly, and within the United States, were strongly anti-Semitic, and were not. Although there were reports of persecution of the European Jewry at the hands of Hitler, especially, many people were not in the United States were not concerned to intervene on the behalf of the persecuted, and many people in the United States did not even want to accept into the United States Jewish refugees from Hitler's persecution in Europe. Many European Jews tried to flee across the Atlantic on ships that ultimately, in many cases, ended up being turned away at port rather than offered refuge. And some European Jews actually had to sail back and go back to Europe, where they were persecuted and in many instances killed by the Nazis. So it was by no means obvious that the United States would enter that fight. In the mid-30s anyway, the United States got more involved once Britain and France declared war on Germany in 1939. And at that time, the United States really began to mobilize as an ally, not as a kind of a non-participating ally of Britain and France. And what that meant was that the United States became the arsenal of democracy. The United States began to mobilize to provide heavy munitions and weapons and other forms of war supplies to Britain and France, usually on for vast sums of money, and usually sums of money that were extended on credits. For example, through the Lend-Lease program, which basically Britain entered into contracts to buy a certain amount of weaponry and war industrial material from the United States over a certain period of time that ended up being incredibly lucrative. And in these contracts, these defense industries that developed around the supplying of weapons to Britain and France were incredibly lucrative. Many factories within the United States converted from making refrigerators or radios or whatever into making war material and supplies for Britain and France, even in 1939. Before the United States was directly involved in the war itself. War mobilization, beginning in 1939 on behalf of Britain and France especially, began to end the Great Depression, all the more so beginning in 1941 with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the incredibly destructive surprise attack which killed thousands of Americans and destroyed hundreds of airplanes, maybe 20 battleships, and finally drew the United States into the war, not only in Asia but also into Europe, because after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Hitler, hoping that the United States would be weakened and distracted by having to fight Japan, Hitler declared war on the U.S. and then very quickly vice versa. And so it began and continued for the next 4 years to 1945. When we talk about the war years themselves, Foner gives some information about the battles, but I want you to focus more on the consequences of the fighting. I want you to focus on the consequences of the war, both in the United States and for the United States in the world. Okay, what changed because of that fighting? I don't care so much about the battles, although I care more about what the battles did to American life and to the position of the United States in the world. We've already talked about how the war changed American life at home in terms of the economic kind of stimulus it offered for all those factories that converted into war manufacturing and overtime production and hiring lots of new people. But the truth is that the consequences of the war at home were both incredible economic opportunities, but also political and social oppression. It was a combination of opportunity and oppression that the war created at home. I mean, it drew many as American men primarily went off to fight. Many women were drawn into the industrial workforce. Many black Americans were drawn into the industrial workforce. Mexican workers were specifically recruited by the federal government to work in strategic industries and in agriculture through something called the Bracero program. The war created a need for workers that for many people appeared as an opportunity. That opportunity was limited, however, because it's certainly the case that women faced discrimination at work. In other words, their salaries were not, and their roles were not equal to those that men had held. Black Americans and Mexican Americans faced, in part because of their increased role in industrial work, they faced vicious discrimination and violence against them, even as they moved in closer to the center of American economic life, but also to a very strong degree, their places there were limited. In other words, there was never any doubt that women and black Americans were fully going to replace those who had gone off and left. And indeed, the GI Bill, which was extended to soldiers, really favored those who fought versus those who stayed, with forms of benefits like education benefits and benefits to help people achieve home ownership, and really brought back soldiers into the center of American prosperity after they had been overseas. So the opportunities were limited, and there were at the same time oppressions. For example, the oppression of Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor. Over 100,000 Japanese Americans were removed from their homes after Pearl Harbor and concentrated in internment camps, which were basically concentration camps by another name, and without the kind of final solution aspect of Hitler's genocidal final solution of Hitler's concentration camps. But so the war was a combination. The war created at home a combination of opportunity and oppression, or constraint, opportunity and constraint, including, of course, limitations on that often result from nationalism and patriotism when it gets mobilized for war and weaponized in that way. It wasn't only Japanese that faced discrimination, but also Germans to some extent, and Italians to some extent, because the United States was fighting Germany and Italy and Japan, the Axis powers, among the Great Alliance with Britain and France. So there's this kind of world. The world at home, the war created a combination of opportunities and constraints. Abroad, the conduct of the war truly transformed the place of the United States in the world, because of the relatively late entry of the United States into the world. It was and because of the relative isolation of the United States, an ocean away from the centers of the greatest fighting, the United States emerged from World War II in a much better position than any Asian country was in and than any European country was in. It was by much less marked and touched by the wartime physical destruction. And at the same time, the United States had ended the war in Japan through the Manhattan Project, which had developed the atomic bomb. The United States was the first country to develop, and it still remains the only country to have used the atomic bomb, which it did twice over Japan to end the war in 1945. And this combination of the United States being relatively isolated from the fighting and having developed and used the atomic bomb really elevated the United States to the position of the supreme global power. And what I want you to begin to think about is how was that position the United States enjoyed in the world after World War II related to the prosperity that characterized domestic American life after World War II, not only within the country, but within the home and the American family. So what we want to look forward to is asking, well, how is the transformed position of the United States in the world related to the transformations that were wrought within American society itself? That's what we want to begin to think about as we look forward to tomorrow's work on the post-war global order and the power and wealth that the United States exercised and enjoyed therein. Okay? So, the terms for today: 4 freedoms, Japanese internment, Bracero program, GI Bill, and Manhattan Project. Once more: 4 freedoms, Japanese internment, Bracero program, GI Bill, and Manhattan Project. I almost have your second exams all graded. I will talk tomorrow about the next exam, which is coming up as usual on Friday. Okay, and it's also be our last exam together before the final essay. We're moving fast. We can do it. We're more than halfway there. Let me know how I can help. Happy Tuesday. Be well.